Welcome to today's LINKOnline Webinar. I'm delighted to introduce Jeff Kane, who will deliver today's session. Jeff is an economist in the Policy and Governance team at Manaki Whenua. His work is largely around understanding people's attitudes and behaviours, especially regarding agricultural production and natural resource management. This project was sponsored by our partners at the Department of Conservation and OSPRI. I know you're going to have lots of questions, so please put them into the chat box early, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the talk. Rest assured, even if we cannot answer today, we will post the Q&As to our website in the next week or so. Now it's over to Jeff. Have you got your screen up there, Jeff?
I've just clicked it. You can see.
Off we go. Looking good. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Christine, for the invitation to present today. Kia ora and good morning, everyone. Today I'm presenting results from research that Robin Kannemeyer, Dean Strong, and I have done into people's attitudes and beliefs about aerial baiting with 1080. This research, as Christine said, was funded by OSPRI and by DOC. Okay. Today I'll give a very brief outline about our work, the context. I'll provide a short description of the theory we used, and then present some of our results and conclusions. Controlling brush-tailed possums is fundamental to eliminating tuberculosis from livestock in New Zealand. Aerial baiting with 1080 is a key method for controlling possums across large areas of inhospitable terrain. OSPRI and DOC were interested in knowing the extent of support among people both in urban and rural areas for aerial baiting with 1080. We based our study on the concept of involvement. The concept comes from social psychology and is widely used in marketing. Basically, involvement is a measure of motivation and is a predictor of the interest a person has in a subject, the time and effort they will devote to the subject. Basically, involvement is a way of distinguishing between people who really care about a subject and those that don't. High involvement is associated with strong interest in a subject, a willingness to spend time and effort gathering information and learning about the subject, and a propensity to develop and hold strong attitudes about the subject. Once an attitude is formed by someone with high involvement, it is difficult to get them to change. People with high involvement will notice and pay attention to messages about the subject. Low involvement, on the other hand, is associated with little interest in a subject, an unwillingness to spend time learning about the subject. People with low involvement in a subject often don't have any opinion at all about the subject. Their attitudes are weak and unstable and are easily changed. People with low involvement are unlikely to notice or pay attention to messages about the subject. There are 5 sources of involvement. These are functional involvement, which concerns matters such as comfort, security, and health. Social involvement, which concerns matters of self-expression, for example, the clothes you wear. Experiential involvement, which is about things like emotional enjoyment and a sense of achievement. Involvement is higher or more intense, the greater is the risk you might make some mistake, and the more serious the consequences of any mistake you might make. We used a framework called the I3 framework to predict people's support for aerial baiting with 1080. The framework proposes that people's support for a policy initiative, such as aerial baiting with 1080, will depend on 3 things: These are first, their involvement with the policy outcome, in this case, reducing possum numbers. Second, their involvement with the policy initiative itself, that is, aerial baiting with 1080. And third, their attitude towards the policy initiative, aerial baiting with 1080. In other words, people's support for a policy initiative depends on how much they care about the policy outcome that's being sought, how much they care about the initiative itself, and whether they think the initiative is a good or a bad thing. Applying the framework in this context means that people's support for aerial baiting with 1080 will depend on their involvement with reducing possum numbers, their involvement with aerial baiting with 1080, and their attitudes towards the idea of aerial baiting with 1080. All of this is summarised in the following figure. On the vertical axis, we measure involvement with the outcome, reducing possum numbers. On the horizontal axis, we measure involvement with the initiative, aerial baiting with 1080. Starting with quadrant 1 on the lower left, we have people who have a low involvement with reducing possum numbers and aerial baiting with 1080. Basically, these are people that are just not interested in reducing possums, and they don't really care about aerial baiting with 1080 at all. Because these people have no interest in either of these subjects, they will ignore messages about them. From a policy perspective, the only options here to engage these people are either nudging or to find an issue that is involving for them, perhaps something like child safety. In the upper left, we have quadrant 2, where we have people that care about reducing possum numbers, but have little interest in aerial baiting with 1080. So these people will attend to measures about aerial baiting. These people will attend to messages about aerial baiting with 1080, but those messages will have to be placed in the context of the policy outcome, reducing possum numbers, in order to gain their attention. On the upper right, we have quadrant 3, where we have a people that care about both reducing possum numbers and about aerial baiting with 1080. If they have a favourable attitude, so they're in the green rectangle, then they will express a strong support for aerial baiting. If they have an unfavourable attitude, so they're in the red rectangle, they will oppose aerial baiting. They will also have definite opinions about what other methods should be used to control possums instead of 1080. People in this group could be persuaded to change their minds. Alternatively, their support could be obtained by incorporating the methods they prefer into a possum control program. Finally, on the bottom right, we have a quadrant 4, which has people that don't care about the outcome. They don't care about reducing possum numbers, but they do care about aerial baiting with 1080. If they have a favourable attitude, then they will support aerial baiting. If they have an unfavourable attitude, then they will express strong opposition to aerial baiting. In a nutshell, the people in the red box don't care about reducing possum numbers, and therefore they think that aerial baiting is wrong. From their perspective, reducing possum numbers and the benefits that might flow from that is not a justification for aerial baiting with 1080. So what we did was to create a questionnaire based on the I3 framework, in which we sought to measure involvement with the idea of reducing possum numbers and involvement with the idea of aerial baiting. We also measured attitudes towards the idea of aerial baiting with 1080 and asked people about their beliefs about the advantages and disadvantages of reducing possum numbers and the advantages and disadvantages of aerial baiting with 1080. We also asked people questions about their individual sense of responsibility for reducing possum numbers. The questionnaire was completed as an online and telephone survey by 920 households in Auckland, Wellington, Taranaki, Nelson Tasman, West Coast and Dunedin. Overall, we found very weak relationships between demographic variables such as age, education and gender, and people's involvement with and attitude towards reducing possum numbers and aerial baiting with 1080. We did find that people on the West Coast were more likely to have an unfavourable attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080, while people in Auckland and Wellington were more likely to be in quadrant 1. That is, the low involvement quadrant where people that have no interest either in aerial baiting or in reducing possum numbers. Here I have a graph of respondents' involvement with reducing possum numbers, which is measured by the vertical axis, and their involvement with aerial 1080 measured by the horizontal axis. The axes are scored from 1 to 5, with 1 indicating the lowest possible involvement and a 5 indicating the highest possible involvement. As you can see, most respondents were in the upper half of the graph, which is good news for OSPRI and DOC, as this means a majority of the respondents are motivated to some degree to reduce possum numbers. However, respondents were spread across the graph from left to right, meaning there is a wide variation in people's interest in or involvement with aerial baiting with 1080. On the one hand, only a small proportion of respondents were very highly involved, which means most respondents will only devote a limited amount of time and effort to thinking about reducing possum numbers and thinking about aerial baiting with 1080. On the other hand, it also means that only a very small proportion of respondents were intensely motivated about aerial baiting with 1080 and therefore likely to express a strong support for or against aerial baiting with 1080. In this figure, I have shown the beliefs that people have about the benefits of reducing possum numbers for the people in each quadrant. The blue line represents people in quadrant 1. The yellow line, is a people in a quadrant 2. The orange line is a people in quadrant 3. And the grey line is people in quadrant 3 and the yellow line is people in quadrant 4. Sorry, orange is quadrant 2. Each line represents the average agreement of respondents in the quadrant with statements about possums, or I should say statements about reducing possum numbers. The lines are all pretty close together, which means there's not much difference across the quadrants in what respondents believed about reducing possum numbers. So, for example, these results indicate there is widespread support for reducing possum numbers because nearly everyone agrees they are bad for the environment and for agriculture. For example, that reducing possum numbers will increase protection for native birds and wildlife, and possum numbers need to be reduced to conserve native plants and forests, and possum numbers need to be reduced to eradicate TB. In this figure, I have grouped all of our respondents in each quadrant according to their attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080. The green circles are those with a favourable attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080. The yellow circles are those who were unsure about aerial baiting, and the red circles are those with an unfavourable attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080. The values in the circles represent the proportion of the total sample size, and the size of the circles matches these values. The good news for OSPRI and DOC is that a majority of respondents were in quadrant 3, and only a very small proportion of respondents were in quadrant 4 and with an unfavourable attitude. That is the little red circle with the number 3 on the bottom right. The not so good news A large group in quadrant 3 are ambivalent about, uncertain or unsure about aerial baiting with 1080. Basically, about 25% of people, the people in the yellow circle in quadrant 3, see the benefits of aerial baiting with 1080, but are concerned about what they see as the undesirable consequences of aerial baiting with 1080. It would be advantageous for OSPRI and DOC if this group could be convinced or persuaded that the disadvantages they perceive have been or are being dealt with. Given the time available for this talk, I will now focus on quadrant 3 for the rest of the discussion. So in quadrant 3, we have in the green circle, respondents who are motivated to reduce possum numbers and who strongly support aerial baiting with the 1080. We have the respondents in the yellow circle who are also strongly motivated to reduce possum numbers, but they are unsure about the use of 1080. As we shall see, they believe it has several disadvantages and they struggle to reconcile those disadvantages with the benefits of reducing possum numbers. Finally, we have respondents in the red circle who are keen to reduce possum numbers but oppose aerial baiting with 1080. In this figure, I have graphed the beliefs of respondents about aerial baiting with 1080 for those that are in quadrant 3. As before, the green represents respondents with a favourable attitude towards 1080. Yellow are respondents who are unsure about 1080, and red are those respondents with an unfavourable attitude towards 1080. A score of 1 represents strong disagreement, while a score of a 5 represents a strong agreement. So, for example, respondents with a favourable attitude agree that aerial baiting with 1080 will save livestock from tuberculosis, is cost-effective and practical. They disagree with the proposition that aerial baiting with 1080 kills more birds than it saves, that it contaminates waterways and is a risk to animals and human health. We can see here the struggle for the ambivalents, the people who are unsure. They are in a bit of a quandary because they are not fully convinced of the effectiveness of aerial 1080 and tend to agree there are significant risks to birds, animals, waterways, and human health. Those with an unfavourable attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080 in the red don't believe 1080 is effective and practical, or aerial baiting with 1080 is effective and practical, and they believe it has significant damaging consequences for health, for pets and livestock, for native birds, waterways, hunting, and so forth. In this figure, I have graphed the involvement with aerial baiting with 1080 for the respondents in quadrant 3. Again, green represents those with a favourable attitude, yellow is those that are unsure, and red are those with an unfavourable attitude. Those in favour of aerial baiting with 1080 have a moderate involvement across all sources of involvement on average. Those who are unsure and those with an unfavourable attitude have a mild to moderate functional, experiential and social involvement, but a very high risk and consequence involvement, which is consistent with the fact that they are worrying about the perceived disadvantages of aerial baiting with 1080. So, what can be done? We know that the respondents in quadrant 3 are fairly enthusiastic about getting rid of possums. And we know they will pay attention to and think about communications and messages about getting rid of possums and aerial baiting with 1080. Consequently, we could first maintain support among those with a favourable attitude by promoting the role of 1080 in reducing possum numbers and the benefits that flow from that. Second, we might increase support among those that are ambivalent, those that are unsure, with messages highlighting, first, the steps taken to minimise unintended consequences, for example, working closely with farmers in planning aerial baiting with 1080 programs, working closely with hunters and communities in planning, ensuring that waterways are avoided when aerial baiting is undertaken, and highlighting the fact that highly trained specialist contractors are used to conduct baiting operations. Second, their support might be increased by sending factual messages about the actual impacts of 1080 on water bodies, people's health, and the environment. And third, highlighting any innovations in bait design and spreading methods that reduce the risk of unintended consequences. Finally, we can engage with those that have an unfavourable attitude towards aerial baiting with 1080. We could invite them to participate in high-level program planning and incorporate their ideas where practical into baiting programs. We can also highlight the advantages of 1080 compared to other control options and provide messages highlighting the steps taken to minimise unintended consequences. So, in conclusion, our results indicate widespread support amongst the community for reducing possum numbers. Our results indicate this support was motivated by concerns for the environment as well as the economic damage that possums cause. However, opinions about aerial baiting with 1080 are roughly equally spread between those who favour it, those who don't, and those who are unsure. A high proportion of the ambivalent, those who are unsure, struggle to balance the perceived advantages and disadvantages of aerial 1080. They are likely to respond favourably to actions and messages that address those concerns. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. That's really interesting. I know lots of people have put some questions in. I'm going to start off with one that's sort of pretty basic to the whole presentation, and was one that I was wondering about as well. What's the psychology behind using the word baiting as opposed to what might be a more accurate term, poisoning? Do you have some response on that, Jeff?
Yes, so in our survey, we use the term baiting as it's reasonably neutral, so that in an effort to reduce any influence our questions might have on the way people answered. But some of the statements that people did respond to did contain the word poison in them.
Thanks, Jeff. That's great. Another question around the outcomes. Why do you express the outcome as reducing possum numbers rather than reducing TB in livestock?
Basically, we worked on the assumption that many people would know, since we were surveying a lot of folk in urban areas, they would not know about tuberculosis in livestock. So the outcome that would be most relevant to them would be reducing possum numbers.
Great, and this is kind of a follow-on to that. Do you have a breakdown of the urban versus rural respondents?
In terms of, we do. So we have a breakdown in terms of beliefs, involvement, attitudes, and all kinds of stuff that we asked about. The main thing that really came out was that urban respondents, as you'd expect, tended to be a little bit more unsure or uninvolved in both reducing possum numbers and aerial baiting with 1080 compared to people in rural areas.
Okay, thank you. Also, just going to the participants in the survey, was this a reason for choosing the regions that you surveyed in? And to what extent were we trying to achieve a demographic representation of the whole of New Zealand population?
Okay, thanks. So we weren't trying to achieve a representation of the entire population of New Zealand. We focused in on those particular rural regions and urban areas for two reasons. One was because the rural areas were areas that OSPRI were interested in conducting operations in, and particularly places like the West Coast, and they're interested in what kind of support they might get there. The reason for going surveying Auckland and Wellington was because OSPRI and DOC were also interested to seeing what kind of support they might or might not have amongst urban residents. And they're the two sort of major urban areas to that we had the funding to look at.
Great, thanks for that. Look, we've just got time for one or two others, and here's a question I can't resist asking. How do you counter unfavourable respondents branding valid science as fake news?
How do you? I guess it depends.
I thought that one would make you think.
Yeah, that one makes me think. It's a little. To be honest, I have to say that countering those people is outside of my area of expertise. I guess what our results, so there's two things you can take away from our results with respect to that question though. One is that that kind of a messaging is unlikely to influence people in the top right-hand quadrant, quadrant 3, because those people spend quite a bit of time, as a general rule, discovering and learning about the topic of reducing possum numbers and aerial baiting with 1080. With regards to the people in the lower left quadrant, the uninvolved, it may change their opinion, but because they're not that interested, they will not hold that opinion very strongly, and they might see something the next day or the day after and switch back in their opinions. So that's about all I can probably really say about that. Thanks.
I think we've got time just to squeeze in one last question, and that was whether you'd done some analysis to look at the variation in responses as a function of respondent ages. So another one of those demographic questions.
Yes. Overall, there was only a very small influence of age on respondents. There was just older respondents and male respondents were just a little bit more likely, but only marginally, to be in favour of aerial baiting with 1080. But it was a really small effect.
Thanks, Jeff. Look,
No worries.
That's going to wrap it up for us online today. I can see there's a number of other interesting questions and some details requested. We will come back to you personally on those, and we will also post the Q&As on our website alongside the slides and the video of this presentation. So there is a chance to engage further with this, and in the follow-up email, Jeff's address will be there as well if you wanted to pick up the conversation with him further. Our next webinar, and the final one for the year, will be on the 3rd of December, and at that we will celebrate World Soils Day. Not quite Christmas, but it is World Soils Day. So watch your emails for invitations to that webinar. And for now, from us, ka kite anō, many thanks for attending our webinar.